I've heard from so many folks from third world nations, I felt a need to make a video especially for them. But for you Americans, Canadians, and British, I'd stay with this video. You just might pick up a few good points. After our intro, we'll go to an interview I did with my wife Benedicta on our last mission in Tanzania, where we talk about African food. And after that, I'll list some of the challenges faced by those who have little money and live in difficult situations, and how they can still conquer the monster of diabetes. Tanzania is a nation we enjoy ministering in, and Benedicta has been here for quite some time. You've been here for over a month. I've missed you a lot.
Miss you too, yes, it's been that long, yes.
So she has been on her own, but she is an African, although not a Tanzanian. So we're going to talk a little bit about the food. Generally speaking, how do you find the food of Africa as it compares to the food of America?
Food is a little different because in America we don't eat fufu. In Africa we eat fufu, and the rice is rice everywhere, but although the rice we buy in America is quite a little different. But when it comes to fruits, we have fruits in Africa a lot. We have pineapples, bananas, avocados, and watermelon, and so on. So a lot of like oranges and all that.
So it wasn't a big surprise to see the American fruit. Sounds a lot like what we have in America.
Yes, it sounds like it's what we have in America. You know, it's the same thing. When it comes to fruits, every part of the world, I think, is the same thing. But although we can find some of them that we find in America here, but there are some other ones they eat to make up with that.
Benedicta mentioned fufu. And sweetie, I don't think very many of our audience would even have a clue what fufu is. So please enlighten us. What in the world is fufu? Not that I don't know, but you need to tell everybody else.
Well, fufu is a traditional food, traditional African food. Everywhere in the country, in Africa, you find fufu. But it's made in different ways, and we call it different names, and it's made in different ways. Like in Nigeria, where I come from, if you go to the eastern part of the world, we call it fufu, and it's made out of cassava. We can make it out of anything, like maize.
Yeah, basically you take some kind of flour,
yeah,
and you mix it with water. Anything else besides flour and water?
There are some other things like in America, I make it out of Quaker oats, and so in Africa, different parts of the world, like in Kenya, they call it ugali. Here in Tanzania, they call it Posha.
So, but the question is, you add your flour, you mix it with water. Anything else? Is there butter? Is there salt? Is there any other ingredient? Or is it just flour and water?
It's just flour and water, and then you mix it and put it on top of a stove. Heat the water up and then stir it, so it kind of comes together and make a kind of a dough substance, and then you just eat it with soup. The soup is made differently. So, and different countries have their own different kinds of soup to go with the fufu.
One of the joys of doing this Beat Diabetes YouTube channel is reading the grateful comments from men and women from what has traditionally been called the third world countries. Now, I know that term isn't used as much as it once was, but whether you call it developing countries or underdeveloped countries or simply the poorer nations, I'm talking about people who simply do not have the economic privileges that we Westerners enjoy. Basically, I'm talking about people who don't have much and can't afford much. I have a little experience with these people. I've spent a lot of time in two areas of the world where there's a great deal of poverty. One is the continent of Africa, and the other is the nation of India. And God has given me a heart of compassion for our friends in these countries that have to struggle so hard just to make the money they need to survive. So when I get a grateful comment from someone in one of these or other third world nations, it's always a blessing to me. I know that when it comes to conquering diabetes and adopting the kind of diet that will enable them to see victory over this monster, they face certain challenges over and above the challenges that we Westerners face. So I put together this video especially for them. However, if you're from a Western nation, don't click away from this video. Much of what I'll be saying applies in some form to every one of us. But let's talk about some of the specific challenges and difficulties faced by our friends in the less developed nations. The first problem is the problem of culture. Every nation has its own culture or cultures, but in the poorer nations, culture is much bigger, far bigger, and weighs far more than in the Western nations. In America, we have so many cultures that culture is really not such a big deal. I grew up in the Midwest. When I first moved to Texas, there was a lady by the name of Ann Richards who was the governor. This lady spoke with such a heavy Texas twang, I assumed that all Texans talked that way. I thought with my Midwestern accent, well, actually, we consider ourselves from the Midwest to be the only ones in America that don't have an accent, but I thought that I'd stand out like a sore thumb. But when I got to Texas, I found that the majority of Texans talked about the way I did due to so many of us from the Midwest and the North moving to the Dallas area for jobs. And we all brought our own little personal cultures so that nobody made a big deal if you didn't eat the foods they ate or talk like they talked. We all just blended together. But in the developing nations, culture is huge, and it plays a major role in one's diet. A Nigerian that doesn't eat fufu would be considered a freak. A Kenyan that doesn't eat ugali would have to turn in his national ID card, as would an Indian who does not eat chapati and naan. And if an American tells his dinner guests, I don't eat rice anymore, some might think it a little odd, but we have so many diets, it wouldn't mean much. But for someone from Africa or India or Pakistan to refuse to eat what their people have been eating and enjoying for centuries, well, that just isn't done. And when it comes to overcoming diabetes, that's a big, big problem. A second challenge for our third world friends is poverty. Many Africans, Indians, and others are living on the equivalent of a few $100s a month. They're doing everything they can just to stretch their money and enable them to survive another month, and there's precious little left over for any additional spending. For us in America, spending $30 for a blood sugar meter and another $20 for testing strips may seem inconsequential, but for many people, this is a huge financial burden. And if they can save up the money and get these, there's just no way they can test very often. Every test becomes a special event and one that they cannot repeat for another week or two. Another problem that having little money creates is that carbs are usually one of the cheapest foods you can buy. Africans eat so much doughy fufu or ugali because these foods will fill their stomachs for little money. They could not possibly afford to eat steaks or even hamburger frequently, if at all. For many poor people, meat is a luxury that you enjoy on special occasions, not something you could eat every night. And that means that carbohydrates are the food of choice for them. For Africans, that means you serve a little gravy and huge mounds of fufu. For Indians, it means you serve a little gravy and 3 or 4 or 5 pieces of chapati. For many Asians, it means mounds and mounds of rice, again with a little gravy and maybe a few specks of meat. One thing that many of our poorer brothers and sisters are eating is sweets. These can be had much cheaper than eggs or meat, and high-carbohydrate meals plus sweets as a dessert lead to a perfect metabolic storm. A third problem for third world men and women is the lack of resources available online. If we Westerners need an ingredient not found in the stores or a special device useful in preparing a low-carb recipe, we just go to Amazon, order it, and have it on our doorstep in a couple of days. But things are not so easy for them. Most of them do not have access to Amazon or eBay or any online low-carb stores. They shop at local markets which do not label their foods with nutritional ingredients and percentages that we have listed on our foods. And most of the foods available to local markets are the same high-carb, blood sugar spiking foods that their mamas ate and their mamas ate going back for centuries. The fourth and final problem we'll discuss is the fact that in third world countries, most of the doctors and medical personnel have been trained in old-school doctrines and practices and are hopelessly behind the times. And by the way, that's probably true for many of the older American doctors as well. You know, guys about my age who deeply distrust all these newfangled concepts like the keto diet, intermittent fasting, the fat-burning mode, and autophagy. Let me give you a little illustration. My wife is an African, and when she first came to America, we were in a store that was advertising a free pair of socks to all who made a purchase. Well, an African is never about to pass up something free. But she forgot about it when we checked out, and then she remembered they were giving away the free socks as we were about to go out the door. So I stayed there by the door, but she went back to talk to one of the employees about the free socks. I watched casually as she talked with the man, but she didn't seem to be able to get him to understand her. Now, I knew she had an accent, but I never found her that hard to understand. But as they talked longer and longer and nothing was happening, I finally had to go over and see what was going on. She repeated to me what she was telling the employee, that she wanted her free stockings. The man looked totally puzzled, but I knew she was asking for the socks. But Nigerians don't call them socks, they call them stockings. I explained to the man that she wanted her free socks, and he quickly understood and got her a pair. Later, I recognized that one reason that my wife had a problem being understood was not just that she had an accent, but the English she spoke was the kind of English we Americans used to speak about 100 years ago. My dad, who was born in 1909, actually used to call socks stockings, and there were a great number of ancient terms that Benedicta used, which Americans have long ago given up. Well, that's exactly the case with many of the third world doctors, although thankfully not all of them. Many of them were trained in the old, worn-out, high-carb, low-fat diet, and they assume that this is what is needed for every diabetic. They were told that diabetes will only get worse and worse, and that you simply prescribe more and more insulin for them and try to help them hold out as long as they can until finally the disease gets the best of them. So this is a major problem. We find this in America as well, but things are changing here, and many doctors are seeing beyond this antiquated view of diabetes diets. In Africa and the other poor nations, this will change eventually as well, but it may take around 100 years or so for that change, and most of you do not have that much time. Okay, so those are the 4 big challenges for our diabetic friends in the developing nations as I see it. What are the answers to these challenges? First, let's address the issue of culture and its attempted influence on your diet. The answer to this one is easy, but it's not pain-free. Just like we in America counsel our young people about drugs, you'll have to adopt the idea expressed in 3 words. Just say no. We're talking, after all, about your body, your future, your health, and your longevity here. No one, whether it's your mama, your daddy, or your neighbors, or brothers, or sisters, has the right to pressure you to eat foods that will be harmful to your body. And if your body happens to be a diabetic body, you have an urgent, pressing, desperate need to cut down those carbohydrates. There's no getting around it. You've just got to do it. Tell people as nicely as you can, but be firm and make no compromises. Let everyone know that for the sake of your health, you cannot eat the way they do. Culture or no culture, you're going to have to trim your carbs and eat your meals in a way that your mama never thought about eating. Well, what about the money issue? For most Americans, it's fairly easy to simply eat a little more meat and significantly less pasta, potatoes, rice, cereal, bread, and sweets. But how can you justify buying more meat when you can barely afford to feed your family as it is? There are 2 points I want to make here. If you can afford it at all, you probably should eat more meat, especially if that will enable you to eat less carbohydrates. Even if it increases your food bill 15%, that wouldn't work out to be too much compared to a major operation for heart disease or having your legs amputated or an eye operation. Even in poor countries, surgery is expensive, and if you go on eating a high-carbohydrate diet, you're probably headed for a major operation down the road. You simply have to get those blood sugar numbers down. But let's use a worst-case scenario and say you can't afford even the slightest increase in your food budget, and eating very much meat is just out of the question. There are some non-meat alternatives. Let's consider a country I know well, which is Nigeria, where my wife Benedicta grew up. In Nigeria, the standard evening meal is vegetable soup with fufu. The soup really isn't a problem. It usually has no noodles and it's not made with flour, so the soup has very few carbs. The problem is the fufu, that doughy mixture that's eaten with nearly every soup. This fufu is nearly 100% carbs, and it is the villain in driving up blood sugar. Now, the culture of Nigeria says that soup is always, I repeat, always eaten with fufu, or gari, which is very similar. But is this a law? Will the fufu police come to your house and arrest you and throw you into jail for eating your soup without fufu? I don't think so. Your dinner guests might look at you funny, but no police are going to come. Now, you say, without the fufu, I'd never get filled up. No, that soup alone probably would not fill you up, but there are other foods you can eat. When I started going to Africa regularly, one of the things that amazed me was the size of their avocados. They are enormous, about the size of an ostrich egg. One avocado is so filling it takes little more than that to make a meal. And they're cheap, around 15 cents or a quarter for one. How about vegetable soup and a monster-sized avocado? Or you could eat vegetable soup with some cut-up vegetables on the side. Another food you find nearly everywhere in Africa, and often sold on the streets, is peanuts. You can buy a small bag of peanuts for next to nothing. Will the police come and arrest you if you eat your vegetable soup with peanuts instead of fufu? No, they will not. You can eat your soup, eat your peanuts, and your blood sugar will hardly move. Now, you may say, yeah, but without all those mountains of fufu, I'll probably lose a bit of weight. Well, what's wrong with that? Weight loss will also help you with your blood sugar problems. And there is no law that says that every African man or woman who is prosperous must be on the heavy side. Yes, I know that's a cultural assumption, but dare to defy these assumptions and concepts and eat for your health and not to satisfy cultural expectations. Not only that, but if you significantly cut down on your weight, you'll require less food and your food bill will go down. You may be able to afford a little more meat at that point. Be a rebel. Let me say that again. Be a rebel. Don't feel like you have to eat to please anyone else. Eat for your health and for the glory of God, and don't become a slave to culture. When it comes to buying a blood sugar monitor and testing strips, if you can at all afford it, do it. Test to find out the peaks that various foods produce and keep a written record. Since you may not be able to afford to do consistent tests and daily tests, write down all your results so you can refer back to them later. Okay, what about the lack of resources, especially online resources? No doubt about it, this is an added burden you face that we Westerners do not. And what this means is probably you'll need to do more cooking than is normal. You can't order too many things, and learn to cook in different ways. You'll have to use some creative substitutes. Flax bread can be substituted for wheat bread. If you have access to YouTube, and I have to assume you do or you wouldn't be watching this video, type in low-carb recipes and see which ones may work for you, given the ingredients you can buy at your local markets. If you can get almond flour, it's amazing how many recipes can work with this. Be creative, pay a little money to go to the cyber cafe if you need to and search for low-carb recipes. Spend a little time, do a little research, and discover new meals and foods that will work for you. One thing that's always cheap are leafy greens. Make a soup with these, throw in some nuts and an avocado, and you have yourself a meal. The basic principle that applies to you achieving victory over diabetes is that you use what you have and don't worry about what you do not have. You may not have as much as we do, but what you have is enough if you use it wisely. With God's help, you can do it. You can see victory over runaway blood sugar. Okay, I think I've talked enough. In fact, I'm sure I'll get comments saying I've talked far too much. But when your life, your health, and your future are on the line, you'll pay the price to listen for a few minutes. I get some people who make comments wishing I would say everything in about 2 minutes and then shut up. They're like that ancient police TV show where the detective would tell the woman he was interviewing, "Just the facts, ma'am." When I hear from these folks who only want the facts in 1 or 2 minutes, I say to myself, these people are simply not desperate enough. They'll probably never see victory over diabetes if they really have it. But to get that victory, you need more than a couple minutes of facts. You need inspiration, you need encouragement, and you need to watch some videos again and again until these truths get in your spirit and bring about motivation and transformation. And once that happens, you're on your way to victory. If you enjoyed and were helped by this video, give it a thumbs up. This will cause YouTube to rank it higher in their search engine and suggest it to more people who are searching for answers, and more people will be able to see it. And consider subscribing to this channel and then clicking on the little bell icon. This will ensure that you're notified every time we post a new video. God bless, and see you again soon.